Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us again for our final run of 2020 with these webinars. And I'm delighted to have the amazing Nick and Chad again back with us this week. Hi, guys.
Hey, what's up?
Great to see you. Thank you also, Kent, for letting us know that the system is working. And greetings to you, Jay, up in Newcastle. Great, thanks for being with us all year on all these sessions. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Amy. Amy's reminded me to remind everyone else about the free shirts as well. So I'll do that. In fact, I should do that now, shouldn't I? Great. So we are not finishing though. Although this is the last session this year, we're carrying on in next year. Same time every Monday, 9 a.m. PST, midday EST, and 5 p.m. UK time. And next January, in about 2 weeks or so, we are starting off with a whole series about Volume Builder in Cinema 4D. Ooh. And you can see the registration links on the Maxon website, so maxon.net. And if you go to events under the news category, then you see a whole range of events. And we'll put these links in the email as normal. But we're doing 4 weeks of investigating all sorts of interesting things inside Volume Builder to help you do sculpting and modeling, as well as 3D printing, and using particles and trace splines and all sorts of fancy things that you wouldn't necessarily have associated with Volume Builder. So it's going to be really interesting. And we've got Ellie and Jonas and Matt back to actually share all this amazingness. And Darren will be also joining us to jump in with a bit of Redshift knowledge. So that's going to be very exciting. And also, we're recording this session as usual. And if you go to the Maxon Training Team channel on YouTube, that's where we host all the recordings. And here's the one from last week where Darren went through Quixel workflows with Redshift and Cinema, and the ones from previously on these sessions, so the particular 5 new features as well. You can have a reminder of those sessions, plus all the, I think it's up to 50 hours now worth of content that we've got on this channel, which are mostly our sessions that we recorded.
Wow.
And I know, it seems crazy. There's something for you to do over Christmas. Anyway, also we've got our merch store where that code still works. So we'll share that code with you, and I'll put it into the chat window and also put it into the messaging and the emails. But if you put in the code demystifying in the merch store, then you get access to a free t-shirt. And all you have to pay is shipping, but we wanted to just make sure that we could get you a t-shirt, and that's good for the rest of the year, I think. Fantastic.
Also, just a quick question, like if there was like a presenter that also entered that code, would there be some way to track who that presenter was that used said code?
No.
The best way to track is to follow all your social media posts with you wearing that shirt tagged in. So cool. Yes, we can organize something for you, Chad. I think I know someone.
Okay, I want
In fact, it's the same link. In fact, you get it yourself. Exactly. Yes. So that would work too. And just a final thing is that if you were wanting to test your knowledge in all the tools that we do over at Maxon, don't forget you can check out for free the first stage of the certifying process for Cinema 4D. And that's just under the Learn section on the Maxon website. So just like click on Learn and go to certification. And we've also got similar free knowledge tests for Red Giant as well. And we'll send you those links to redgiant.com/volume/certification.
Wow. Lots of knowledge.
That's awesome.
But these are free tests. They're 1 hour long. They're 50 questions, and it's a really good chance to actually test out your knowledge across the program about it. Cool. So I think, what have I forgotten? I think that's it for now. And here we go. Oh, Jay's just signed up for his t-shirt. £3.67 shipping. Brilliant. Merry Christmas or happy holidays. Santa has arrived. Yeah, great. So I'm going to hand over to you, Nick, because this week we're looking at some of the nice physics and new physics capabilities, the simulations inside Particular 5 that were released only 3 or 4 weeks ago, including flocking and meander and all that fantastic stuff. So I'm going to make you a presenter. Here we go.
Awesome. I just turned off my webcam so you guys can hopefully see my main screen. Does everyone see After Effects here in the background?
I do.
Amazing. Yeah. Awesome. So we're going to start talking about one of my new favorite physical simulations. I hope, Chad, you agree with me, which is flocking.
You know I do.
The power of this, it's kind of incredible when you think about it as in just one physical simulation and the amount of control you have over your particles with just this one setting. So I thought we would start off with sort of a basic run through of flocking, and along the way take a look at a few features that are built inside, primarily, which is really interesting, predator to prey. And even before that, let me just start with a fresh version of Particular. And I would encourage everyone slightly after this webinar to go on YouTube and then just start looking at like flocking imagery of birds dancing. And this will give you like an idea of how this simulation is meant to run, and kind of a simulation that you can run with your particle simulation with how birds move as they flock through the sky. It's pretty amazing. And I'm just going to head into the designer and set up a pretty simple simulation to start, and then we'll hop into the simulation section. So here's my emitter type. I'll keep it at point. These particles per second are fantastic. And I'm just going to go over to the motion tab and make this directional so that I can point my emitter to emit this over here to the left. And why not have this point emitter start off on the side of the screen? And not to mention under the motion section, I'm going to increase the velocity so that they're being projected out a little bit more and decrease the direction spread. So even setting up this amount, we can now start to introduce the new simulation features. Just one other thing I'm going to add under particle type is just to increase the lifespan of these particles so they last for quite a bit of time, just over 10 seconds here. Now, we covered environment last week, so here's the simulations tab. And for a while in particular, there's been the ability to have bounce as well as fluid motion, which is kind of its own thing compared to the other simulations. So flocking, meander, and bounce, unfortunately, they won't work with the fluid motion system. However, something new in Trapcode Particular 5 is the fact, which we mentioned in week 1, that fluid simulations can actually run with fast physics, which you weren't able to do in previous versions. So another great use for kind of using the turbulence fields built into fast physics with your fluid motion simulations. So for now, let me just enable flocking. And we're already start to see a huge difference in the way that these particles move. And that's because there's 3 forces that are acting upon them. That is attraction, separation, and alignment. The best way to see this is to sort of zero out 2 of them. So I'm going to zero out separation and alignment. And just to show you, while these particles are in fact being projected outward because of their velocity, they're also attracted towards each other based on a numerical value. Currently, that's set to a value of 10. It can go all the way up to 100. And kind of halfway through the screen, you can see here that these are attracted towards each other in this flocking simulation and start to bunch up. Now, by default, attraction and separation are 2 separate values of 10. So what you can see here is an attraction set to 10 and also a separation set to 10. So these are moving through or being projected outward because of the extreme velocity. And along the way, these particles start to become attracted towards each other, as well as become separated towards each other along their path of projection. Now, if I just focused here on the separate value, you can see here that it almost expands how much these shoot outward, from that directional velocity. If it was just a separation, these are going to move away from each other. But it's really these combined values, I'll set these to 20 now, that make up for that flocking simulation. Okay? Awesome. So the last one just to introduce here is alignment. And this sort of keeps all of your particles in a line, or rather close to each other as they're moving or being projected outward. So my velocity, if I go to the motion section, actually has your velocity amount and a direction spread. If I bring this direction spread down to actually even bring it up, you can see here that these particles are still trying to form some sort of alignment as they travel across the screen. Now, as I look at this particle simulation, I'm going to introduce back some of that attraction and then separation, and then go to which I'm going to say is my favorite value before predator prey, and this is what's called a target attraction. So once this is enabled, you have the ability to set this target position, and right now it's set towards the middle of the screen. However, this set of particles isn't attracted towards it just yet until we increase this target attraction value. So I'm just going to crank this up to a value of 10. And eventually these particles are going to start to become attracted towards now the center of the screen and slowly become bunched up here. They start to become attracted towards that target attraction based on a range of view value, which is set to 500 pixels. So if I increase this amount to 1,000, so now this target attraction is in its range, right away as these particles are projected, while they are somewhat aligning and attracting and separating, they are also attracted to that target position. And this just becomes so powerful and can start to really build up that flocking simulation. So in this case, we'll start off with, I'm going to take this target position and settle an amount where it's over here on the left-hand side of the screen at 1920. These particles can't really see it just yet until they are within 1,000 pixels of it. But if I increase this amount to 2,000, all of a sudden, these particles now start to become attracted to that line right away. And this becomes even more fun if you start to introduce a few environment controls into this. We talked about this last week and focused on it by itself, where under the particle type, it has a series of particle physics which have been introduced in Trapcode 5. So every particle has a default mass value of 10 right now. If I actually decrease this, you'll see that these particles are, in fact, traveling a little bit faster based on their mass. In fact, I can also just introduce a little bit of random percentage to adjust my physical simulation. This can also be introduced with environment where, let me just add some wind here, which will pick up right when these particles are being emitted with their velocity. And as long as the wind's not too strong, let me back up on that, let's say to a value of -60, they are projected upward a little bit, but eventually get back on track to that target position. And this setup of like particle simulations are starting off here with flocking, in my mind is just, it's incredible. It's just amazing what you can do with this. And then also introducing your environment physics and simulation altogether. All right, so that's kind of like your stage one of your flocking. The other thing it got me to think about is that once you start to set this up, so we have these particles, they're being projected, affected by their environment, their wind, and then eventually towards their target attraction. One thing that I thought was really cool is that you can easily take under the physics simulation in After Effects, if we go to the flocking, this target position amount and start to keyframe it. And it just creates all of these really interesting particle movements, so to speak. So right now, it's still attracted to that right-hand side of the screen. Once it gets close, I could move this value through keyframes down to the right-hand side of the screen. And you can see here that the particle projection will eventually, it will kind of reach its target and then slowly go down to its new point. And you could just adjust that over time. even more so on the thought of like how to use this target position to create even more realistic particle simulations would be to, let's say, attach that target position, whether it be to a null object or a light, to create some really interesting looks here with those particles. So I don't know, Chad, did you experience like some similar type of experimentation? I know you have your own stuff to show soon, but have you been using it in a similar way?
Yeah, I think for me, there's so much there and it can do so much, and it's such an interesting like paradigm, like an interesting way to look and think about particles and their use, that I feel like I've just kind of just scratched the surface. Even like preparing for these webinars, I feel like there's just so many things that you can do that I feel like I've just kind of gotten the tip of the iceberg. But yeah, it's insane.
Yes. And there was a question that came in when you were just answering my question there, Chad, which was, can you have like inverse values of attract? And there are no like negative values for it, but attract and separate are kind of like your symbiotic relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And if the numbers are fairly similar, these particles are equally attracted as well as they'll separate from each other. So you can kind of use them or think of them as inverse values to some extent, or like they're the opposites from each other, while a line is its own thing. So this is like stage 1 of flocking, in my opinion. And stage 2 of flocking has to do with how you can then combine this with predator-prey simulations. So in fact, for this, I'm just going to reset particular. And come on, After Effects, don't let me down just before Christmas. It's giving me like a spinning ball right now, so just bear with me for a second. Hopefully.
I mean, it's lovely to watch while we're waiting, though.
I know, it's just like it is
a little attraction simulation.
To watch. Let's just let it go by and watch the dance of these birds. On the 12th. Oh, there we go. Okay, so here we go. Awesome. It has surrendered. It's beach ball there. This is great. Okay, and I'm just going to press U because I added some keyframes here. And actually, you know what? I will just get rid of this version of particular. And you know, why not add a fresh version? Here we go. One more spinning beach ball, and then we'll be set. Right. Okay, cool. So here, again, we're back to this point-based system, and I'm going to hop into the designer, and we're going to set up a predator-prey simulation using 2 systems. So system number 1 is relatively similar. Got to watch those sides of my screen. All right. So heading here to the motion tab again, I'll set something up in this particular case to make it directional again. We'll set it to a value of 90. And I'm actually going to change the emitter not to just emit from a point, but a box. So this is a little bit bigger, but we don't need that big. So it'll be a value of 300. And I want this, set of particles to kind of start from the left-hand side of the screen. Again, they're being projected outward by their velocity. And for this, I'm actually going to go to the particle type and rely on one of several preset sprites which are loaded inside the designer that we can use. So by default, this goes to be a bunch of squares because we haven't loaded in a sprite. But if we choose this sprite, here are all of this huge, large preset category of sprites that have been in the designer for a while. And I'm just going to head down to organic matter and select this cell number 1. So that's now loaded in. There's a little bit of these coming in and out. So I'm going to go to my opacity section and just have these fade in and fade out and increase the size so we can see this a little bit better, followed by decrease the amount of particles and maybe increase their size. So this is my first particle system, and I'm going to enable flocking for it. So right away we get a certain amount of attraction and separation and alignment, and a target position that we can set up. So for this cell-based system, I'll set it to the right-hand side of the screen, and then make sure that the target attraction is brought up so it is attracted to that area. And I'm just going to increase the velocity a bit to shoot out these particles a little bit faster. And the reason I'm doing this is eventually when they get within that 500 pixel range, we can see this a bit better if we increase the life of this to 10. They'll then start floating towards that point that I set up here. Or yeah, which is about 1920. I'll actually increase the range of view even more in this case so we can see that. So they've got their attraction and all of a sudden they're floating to that point. In this case, they have a target destination, but these cells happen to be, I'm going to identify them as prey. And once I do, they get this additional value, which is set to evade. And this is how much they're going to evade from a secondary system that's identified, or any system that's identified as a predator-based system. So let's do that. Let's give them something to evade from. I'll actually just turn this off, actually create a new system, then turn off the primary system. Here we have, another set of particles. However, for this relatives position, I'm going to move it across the screen on the right-hand side. Also create that box-based system and create a directional motion, having these emit over to the right. And for the velocity, I'll actually increase these because these are more fierce, these particles. So there we go. They're 800 in terms of their velocity. And then in terms of the amount, there's a lot less of them. Okay, so let's choose a sprite to go along with this. So again, I'll go to the sprite category and choose a sprite here in this large library, another cell. Any cell that you like? Chad, do you like this one? Or do you want another one?
That's the greatest of all the cells.
Okay, we're gonna pick this greatest of all the cells. Okay, there we go. That's the one. And they're a little too small. They're not, predator-like enough. So I'll increase their size to like 50. And maybe let's not have them all have the same size. And let's go to simulations. Right now, this is off. Let's have them part of that flocking simulation. And to see this a bit better, I don't want them to be kind of attracted towards each other just yet. So they're kind of just doing their own thing from the velocity. But what we will do is on the opposite side of the screen, have it attracted to a position at the 0 point here. Let's make it a value of 50, so they're quite aggressive, and increase that range of view to a value of 2000. So there we go. You can see that they're streaming along their path, but now we're going to introduce them and create them to be predators. So at some point, the best way to describe it is that these guys are kind of going to their target position, but once they enter a range of view where they can see these cells as well, they change course somewhat on a pursue-based value. And that value here is 10. So you can see how fast they're moving. And then these particles themselves are starting to move away from these particles when they see them within that range of view based on their evade value. If I came here to that first system and set the evade to something like 0, they just go along their way and these particles are going to attack them. Well, they're going to just continue to go to their point while these try to attack them. If I increase that evade value, they're going to move away from this particle system a lot faster and just get going home in the opposite direction. So this presents some really interesting simulations that you can do with multiple systems of setting up predator and prey and then changing those evade as well as those pursue values between these particle systems. Now I'll just apply this to add this to the project and head over here to a comp where this is the simulation is more built up. And I have a few kind of effects that I experimented with, again, using Universe to sort of finalize this. But there's a background of a soft gradient here. That's mixed in with another gradient of a different color using some blend modes. We then have just above the particles an actual adjustment layer that has a few things. One is this heat wave effect, which causes a little bit of distortion as these particles go across the screen. The other is a spectralicious, another gradient that's on top. A shrink ray effect that kind of creates this fast, narrow depth of fields, along with overlight where we're getting those glows. And last is this effect called long shadow, which I thought was just an interesting look for these particles, where I'm kind of creating a shadow on the gradient background as they move throughout. So that kind of created a nice little bit of separation from the gradient as one predator attacks another prey of cells. Pretty cool.
Really cool, Nick. Mohammed raised an interesting question, which I thought was probably good to get your take on, about how the program, how Particular uses GPU versus CPU. And I just put a little note in the question notes there saying that you can choose either. And also, if you're using a sprite, then it's recommended to use GPU because of the dual processing, or depending how many cores you got on your GPU, then that can process things simultaneously. But just wondered how you had it set up on your system, Nick.
I think originally when I was just working, I was just working with the particles themselves, so I had it, and there were a lot more in this initial simulation, right? So I had it on CPU initially, but then I actually switched it when I started using the graphics at some point on this and had it running on the GPU for a little bit as well. But since then, by the way, I went back into the designer, into the gear icon here, just to show the different types of particle accelerations that you can run inside of the designer. You got the CPU and then the GPU. And they kind of give a little bit of information about the different types of GPU particle rendering as well that you could use. But in the case of the sprites, so the graphics themselves, this is a pretty big toss-up because this is a fairly also calculated physical simulation as well, wouldn't you say, Simon? In terms of
like the
movements and how, depending on how many particles you have. So that, I think, tends itself to be also a CPU friendly. So this is sort of a toss-up where you might want to use both at certain periods as you're building your particle simulation.
Yeah, it's an interesting toss-up, as you say, because simulations process more efficiently on the CPU. In fact, they have to, some aspects of them have to process on the CPU because they're calculating it's a simulation rather than an emulation, whereas GPUs process layering and blend modes and shadows and that sort of thing in the frame more efficiently. And the rule of thumb we usually recommend for this is try it out. You can see when Nick's clicking now in the general effects controls tab, you can switch in there just between the different settings. So you could jump in between CPU and GPU and just see which particular one renders faster, because it depends. Classic answer, it depends. But it depends on how your scene is and how that is set up, what particles you're using, and also the CPU and the GPU on your system as well.
I was just twirling up a bunch of properties just to show that what Simon was talking about, those render settings. I click back on my primary system. That's where I see those settings just kind of located towards the bottom, where we see it, the acceleration set to CPU, and then the render mode.
Yeah, and Mohammed's got a follow-up question talking about a 12-core with a pretty powerful CPU versus a Vega 8 gig graphics card. I think it's not really a question of either or, it's how your project is set up, or your effect is set up, and also whether or not you're using other effects. Like I like the stacking of effects you've got with Universe, and they process all via OpenGL on the GPU. So when you're working with this, you could do a couple of tests in Particular and just see which works better, and then factor in other things that are going on in your comp. So I know that's a non-answer, but the practically is just a good understanding of how these things process in the background.
Yeah. It's like all this information and still, which one do I use?
and it doesn't really matter which operating system you're on and what particular protocol, whether you're on CUDA or whether you are processing on Mac, then it automatically will use the system that you've got on your machine. And just a quick comment on there, Mohammed's asking, does it process on Metal? And Metal is coming to Particular. At the moment, it's not using metal, but it's one of those things which the engineers are working on and will be here reasonably soon.
Awesome. And I think, you know, just to add a quick note to that, I think, you know, the fact that there's a non-answer to that question, like, is indicative that it is a good question. Like, you know, a lot of times we want like a very simple, clean answer. And it's like sometimes there just like kind of isn't one. And it's good to know that there's not a simple, clean answer. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. It depends. I'm going to get that as a tattoo, I think.
I think this is another shirt for the Maxon store. It depends.
Yes.
Oh, that's fantastic. We should take this on the road, guys. We should have like a half stand-up comedy, half tutorial show that we do on the road. I think it'd be great. So I've stolen the screen from Nick. Thank you, Nick. And I just wanted to add like a couple bells and whistles, and then we have like plenty of time to answer questions. I want to cover a couple new features, but you know, as I've been fiddling around with this stuff, I just had a couple like very quick examples. A lot of what I'm going to show here is just a couple of examples of me just kind of like fiddling. And you know, the flocking stuff is so interesting, the way that particles move apart. And you kind of tell this from Nick's presentation in the beginning when he was kind of explaining flocking in the beginning, but you know, just being able to use this with like other purposes that aren't like organic, like something with like motion graphics where you just kind of having particles do whatever. So in this case, there's an invisible second system. It's just kind of like a ball, like one sphere, one particle that just kind of has a target attraction to the other side. And as it moves, you can just kind of see these particles just kind of like disperse and move apart. And sometimes behavior like that is something exactly what you want, or maybe we want these particles to stick closer together with more air resistance, or more like less separate, or more align, or more attract, or whatever. And it's kind of like the question that we were just talking about with a CPU versus GPU. Like, it depends. Now you have all these different options for how you want your particles together. There's fast physics options, there's simulation physics options now in the environment, there's, you know, attraction, flocking, like all that kind of stuff. And so just playing with them with all types of particle things, not just organic stuff, but just like motion graphics, is pretty cool, even though this example is, you know, nothing to write home about. But like, it's just kind of a good reminder that we don't have to use these things just for like, you know, organic simulations. Here's another example of using like flocking, and this is like a previous thing that I showed in a very first iteration a couple weeks ago. But there's these like particles, and I want these particles to kind of like shoot out in the center, like kind of like be attracted to the center. So again, I have an invisible particle that's just kind of like a line that goes through the center, and then these little like white dots have this attraction and separate, and they're kind of like hovering around the center in this like really organic way. So actually, I didn't even see all this stuff that's going on. I'll start that workout right there. But you can see these particles again, just kind of like hovering around the center, and that's a fun thing to play with. We're going to be coming back to this example in just a moment. But what I want to talk about here, introduce you to another new concept in the physical simulations world, and that is meander. And when you open up the physics simulations, you'll see these four things: bounce, meander, flocking, fluid. Fluid has been there. Bounce has been revised, but it's now here in the physics simulations. And I'll talk about the revisions to that in just a moment. And Nick so wonderfully covered flocking, and I'm going to talk about meander. Now, flocking, as we just learned, essentially covers the sociology of the particles. It's basically how these systems work together in kind of like a communal, tribal way, how different systems interact with other different systems. Again, it's like sociology. But meander is like psychology. Meander controls like the individual particles' thought process, if you want to go that direction. I guess I just did. So again, flocking controls the relationship of different systems, and meander controls the particle behavior. And it does just what it sounds like. It like helps particles just kind of meander. So if I enable this, actually, before I enable this, let me just like play this so you can see what's going on. We have basically nothing happening. These particles have no velocity, they're exploded on the scene and they just kind of stay there. So they're kind of like emulating Trapcode form, if you will. So if I enable Meander, we get a little bit of behavior there at their default settings. So initially there's not anything, but like now it's almost like they're shoppers at a mall. Like we're looking at an aerial view of shoppers at a mall. Like these particles just kind of start meandering. They start kind of moving around, and it gives this illusion that each of these particles has this kind of like independent thought process. Like they all have their own kind of agenda. Like this, you know, dude is kind of, he's doing something. I don't know. He's going for it though. And so we have more speed and more intensity with this particle, and other particles are just kind of, I don't know, just hanging out. And so we can go into the Meander settings and choose how much the direction is impacted by this. And basically this is another fractal, and we've seen these controls all throughout Trapcode settings. And so we can control the fractal with the Meander controls and then choose how much that fractal affects the speed. So if I crank this up, then it will allow these particles to move much faster. And again, because this is a physics simulation, it happens over time. So it starts kind of like building on, so to speak. So then these particles eventually allowed to go much faster. Now there's very, very little, if any, velocity here. If I open up the emitter section, yeah, we have like a 1 velocity. So if we were to crank this velocity up more, then that would give more intensity to these particles as well and kind of get them going. So Meander again allows you to give each individual particle its own kind of behavior. So, you know, if like, again, just a few quick examples that are more real world here. Like if I have these cars that are drifting and actually they're just moving, but giving them Meander kind of gives them each their own kind of direction and movement and speed. I also went and you can use these together. So like Nick mentioned that that fluid is kind of its own thing. And you could adjust fluid with the fast physics. So those could be impacted by fast physics. But flocking, meander, and bounce can all work together at the same time in the same world and respond to other systems that you have in particular. And they could also respond to the environment, gravity and wind and the turbulent field as well. So all this stuff can be this big hodgepodge of stuff that's all working together. So in this case, I have this like soccer or football, if you come from across the pond. And so I have these characters kind of going after the ball. So these are like predators and the ball is their prey. And so it's kind of moving and they're kind of following after it. And there's also a little bit of meander on these as well. So that as these particles are moving, they are kind of like spinning and kind of drifting on their own. So they all have kind of a mind of their own and are also following after this little target there. So a lot of just like kind of quick, fun examples I was just kind of playing with just to kind of see like what we could have these particles do, which is really interesting to me. So they don't all go after the things in the same way. It doesn't feel as like set in stone. I don't know, with a lot of like simulations where you're having like particle behavior or like a world behavior, there just doesn't feel like there's enough autonomy to me because they're all just kind of mindlessly doing the same thing in the same way. And Meander, I find, is this really great tool to be able to give, again, some autonomy, some individuality to particles as well. Now, let's talk about this new bounce system. For those of you that are familiar with this, this is going to be a little bit of review for a quick second, and then I'll get into the new stuff. So we basically have, you know, these particles shooting out different colors. Let me make that bigger there. Particles shooting out different colors and they're kind of going all over the screen. And it's like confetti in all directions. And I basically have these 3D layers, these solids set up, and I colored them RGB, even though the colors are gross with the particles, just so you could see what's going on here. So I have, again, rotated in 3D space, the red on the right or the left, and then the green on the right here. They're just angled indifferently, and then the floor, this kind of like blue one. And in times past, if we wanted to go into bounce, we could enable bounce for particles, and then we can choose how we want to have them bounce. And now we actually have 3 different bounces and can choose how we want them to be. So I'm just going to use these defaults for bounce mode 1 as an infinite plane. You could use the size of the layer so that particles can go around it and not bounce, or we could use the alpha channel of the layer as well. But I'm just going to choose an infinite plane so that way particles can't go to the left or right of the bounce plane. And I'm going to choose the bounce layer, which again needs to be a 3-dimensional layer. That's one of the things that tripped me up when and also if I don't use bounce for a while, honestly, it trips me up because I forget. But you can't just make a 2D layer and make a mask of this shape. It actually has to be a 3-dimensional object, a layer that you put into 3D space. So again, it's not what you're looking at 2D that counts, it's where it exists in 3D space. So now if I play this back, this object on the left, this solid on the left creates a bounce reaction. So now these particles are all hitting this and they're bouncing off, or the ones that actually hit here are bouncing off. And again, new to this version of Particular is that we have multiple bounces. So I could actually go to bounce 2 and set this up to be the thing on the right and have that bounce as well. So then when they hit this right solid, they bounce. And then also bounce 3, I could set this up to be the floor and have that bounce as well. So now when these particles go, they bounce off the left wall, the right wall, and the floor as well. Now, what's kind of cool is that we have bounce strength and bounce random, so we could play with the bounciness of how these particles are. This also interacts, like everything here in the physics simulations, it uses the mass of the particle. So if we go into the particle section and we go into particle physics, we could adjust the mass and the air resistance and all those things, and all that stuff affects the bounce as well. Now, what's cool about this is that in the collision event, we say the word bounce, and it's not just bounce. There's so much that you can do with bounce. It's not just bounce. Again, you can have the particles slide, you could have the particles stick, or you can have the particles kill. So I'm going to turn off bounce here, or change the left wall to slide, so the particles will slide. And then on the right wall, I'm going to have the particles stick. And then on the floor, I'm going to have the particles kill. So then as this goes here, then we have particles sliding on the left. We have particles sticking on the right. There we go. And then we have the particles, when they get to the ground, just dying off and killing them. And we could go in and change some of these stuff, like on the slide on the left side, we can control the slide friction. So maybe we want them to have a little bit more friction as they slide.
This is so incredibly powerful, in my opinion, Chad.
Yeah,
just
right?
Because, going back probably about 3 years ago with Particular, before the designer and before the multiple systems, with bounce, you used to have multiple versions of Particular, on separate layers, and then you would have each of those layers, let's say, targeted to one floor, but then you'd set the different modes of the type of collision event. And now, on one system, you could essentially have the same bounce layer referenced, right? But then particles doing 3 different things, essentially, some sticking, some killing, some sliding, if I'm correct.
Yeah. And then you could have 16 systems. So you could have 16 systems with 3 bounces each, all doing crazy crap and interacting with each other.
On one layer.
On one layer, on one instance of Particular, which is really, really great. And again, the fact that these interact with each other is really epic. And to me, the thing that I find that I use the most, well, so far, I mean, it's been out for a month, but the thing that I use the most so far is this kill option. Because when you create a new system, you can have the new system, because of Emit from parent and that whole thing that we covered in week 1 of this month. You could have it emit when the parent dies. So you could have you could have bounce things that are triggering the death of particles that then trigger the birth of new particles. So it sounds like very Thanos-y, but we can have that control over the life of parents, which then can control the birth of new particles. And again, just to go back over this more crude version of this example I showed before, we have these particles that are moving, and there is a bounce card right here where the hands are. It's turned off. If I turn this on, this is collision plane right there. And so then as these particles hit that, they die. And then there are these stars that turn on when once the parent particles, these lines, die out, and that triggers this. So then you can create these kind of reactions where, you know, something goes and impacts something and takes a while to render. I was not very careful in how many particles I put into the simulation. But then we could have events like this where there are particles reacting to a collision because of all the emit from parent stuff and all of the new bounce stuff improvements. And again, I think I've mentioned this, but all of this stuff can work together. All the bouncing and the meander and the flocking, the predator and the prey, and the emit from parent system, all these things can be combined, and the new physics, all that stuff can be combined and used together as you need your boat floated, however you need for your project. So yeah. And like, that's the whole thing.
A couple of questions in the chat, Chad. I wonder if you could just have a look at those. For example, the Z position of the emitter, and also the fact that we've got 3 bounces, which is the limit for this version of Particular, which is an improvement on the last one, but there are 3 set up currently.
Yes, 3 bounces for each system. So there's 16 systems, and each one is allowed to have its own 3 independent bounces.
16 systems, eh? That might be a question in the certification online test.
Ooh, cheating, kind of.
Don't
legal
give
cheating.
Come on.
Well, it might be a question about that.
Hey, Simon, I'm not seeing the chat questions. Is it possible for you to relay those?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
The question from Martin was, is the Z position of the emitter set to be the middle of the planes?
Is the Z position of the emitter set to be, I don't know how to answer that. I don't know the answer to that question.
I think it's a question about where they're going to hit on the actual planes themselves. So for the solids, I think it depends if it's an infinite plane or whether it's where it's positioned in 3D space and where the 3D emitter is located. Unless you want to give us some more info, Martin, on that. And also, Drake had a question from your previous example about Meander. And instead of starting off with a solid series or grid of particles and then creating a meander, can you run it the other way and do your meander resolving back into what he describes as full order?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that there's a way to do that technically, but you can use inside of the global controls for the primary system. So you have to go to the primary system, and then inside the global controls, you do have the physics time factor. So you could actually take this backwards if you wanted to kind of like undo a simulation or have it go in slow motion or whatever. It's kind of a hack, but physics time factor is kind of one of those things that can get you out of some pinches if you need something to like all of a sudden slow down or stop or reverse motion or bullet time or whatever. This is kind of like the cheat for all those kind of things. But a lot of times with simulations, like with fluid or with flocking, I mean, it's kind of like real life and very organic in the sense that you're kind of like setting something free. You know, you're initiating like some type of simulation, and it's really difficult to get that back when you're doing that. Like if you're pouring out water, for example, like a pitcher of water, it's really hard to kind of like undo that or get that back. So with the fast physics, like stuff like that might be more possible because it's just emulation. But with simulations, it's very difficult to start with chaos and then return it to order without using a hack like the physics time factor. I mean, that's what that's my understanding with just my general understanding of like simulations. But Nick, Simon, if you guys have other ideas, then, you know, correct me and educate me.
I think the official name for hack is advanced technique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
The old school way to do it, as Kent has just pointed out on the questions, is just to run it backwards and using the comp controls.
Yeah, like do like a time reverse or yeah. Pre-comp it, that whole business.
Absolutely, you can use the wonders of the rest of After Effects to manage that. But
yes.
I think you're right, Chad. It's the nature of the simulations that are starting out from a point and then calculating the locations of each particular particle over time. So that would be a way to do it. I suppose you could do an attract to a particular point if you wanted to resolve it into a logo, and then have logo maybe as an emitter itself. But depending if you needed that in that specific example, as Drake said, if you needed a grid, then that's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I think it's like something just to get used to, and that's why I kind of went on my little like you know, like rant for a second, because, you know, with something like form or whatever, there's like a lot of ways to like loop the behavior. And so as a motion graphics person, it's really cool to be able to have the ability to like run something backwards or have something loop or whatever. But when you're getting into like real physics simulations, you don't have that. It's like a trade-off. You know, you give up the ability to have like looping and, you know, to flexibility as far as like the animation goes, and you give that up for the realism. So, and I love that Particular does both. You know, it does the fast physics and it also does the simulations. So you could pick your poison, whichever one you want to do.
That's true. Martin followed up with a great question about the infinite plane, taking care of ensuring the emitter collides with the plane. But he's got an interesting question about it not being an infinite one. And can the emitter be positioned in Z space to collide or partially collide, like at the corner of a building or a cliff edge? And the quick answer to that is yes, Martin, you can do that. And in fact, it reacts to alpha channels, or rather masks, in the solid itself. And I'm just going to post a link to a tutorial where Harry Frank goes over exactly that, where you can have a series of particles appearing like they're falling through a gap in a particular solid.
Which is amazing. I need to like check that out because I do have problems using bounce a lot, unless it's like set up for me. So if I'm doing something like this, which is like a simple example that I created, where the particles, I know where that point is, or if I'm doing something like this from Cinema, where I'm bringing in, and this like collision plane was actually like Cinema geometry with the external compositing, yada, yada. And so then like Particular knows where that's at and where the plane is. But I find if I set up more complex examples and try to do this on my own of like, you know, different places in Z space, like it's challenging sometimes to get the bounce in the right spot where it's aligned with the particles. So like that's one of the challenges I have with it. So yeah, I want to watch that tutorial and figure that out.
Absolutely. So many good bits and pieces. That's on the Red Giant tutorial section.
Oh, you know what? Another new feature I don't know if we've covered is that you can create a null. So one of the challenges that I hear a lot when I'm teaching people is that like a lot of times, you know, especially after doing like a camera track, then Particular will respond and respect the 3D space and will just be in some crazy spot where you don't know where it's at and there's not really a way to get access to it. And so now you can create a null and then you can have that as a controller for Particular and be able to know exactly where that's at. And I think that's a new feature in this version of Particular too, right, Simon? Or am I mistaken?
Yes, they had the capability in Mir before as well, and that's kind of emerged in Particular in this time too.
Yeah, so that's really handy to be able to like know exactly where in 3D space your emitter is, which is, you know, really helpful for all this kind of stuff when you're trying to figure out like how to get stuff to respond to it and all that kind of stuff.
Follow-up question for the flocking. Can you restrict one of the axes of movement so that you're only running along one or say two axes, say X and Y rather than Z?
Nick, I'm going to defer to you. You're the flocking guy.
As it were.
That's a great. I'm the flocker.
We got 55 minutes in before that joke.
Yeah.
I'm so proud of us.
In terms of restricting the movement, I mean, you can restrict the movement of your emitter, but I'm not exactly. Oh, sorry, meander. He meant, not flocking. Like you can restrict the movement of how things are being emitted. However, like the physical simulation or force that takes upon it is all kind of combined to the multiple properties that parameter supports, so to speak.
Yeah.
Got it.
And it kind of goes back to the same thing with like the trade-offs of like speed or not speed, like realism versus the emulation systems that are faster and more fake and stuff like that. So, so yeah, it's like you don't have total control over how these particles behave as much. You control like the system, and they just kind of like are allowed to like live their lives, so to speak.
Live their lives all by themselves.
So much fun that can be had with the various naming strategies of these particles.
So much.
Like we talked about in the previous week. Think about the parents, Chad.
Yeah, I know. From end of life, we'll kill the parents, commit patricide, and then gives life to our particles. That's awesome.
I was just thinking too when we were talking about flocking and meandering, and thinking of how powerful that could be when you attach, let's say, a particle system to a light, and then even have that light travel like in the Z position, just as an add-on, and have like particles kind of flock around the emission source.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah.
I was just thinking about a lot of room for multiple like particle simulations, and then having like particles more naturally kind of follow the emitter that you set up as well, with just a little bit of flocking values added to them.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So that was it. That's all I had to offer.
That's so creative. I can't wait to see like in a year, like what people are coming out with like all these new features and stuff like that. Like,
yeah,
that's just, there's just so much like potential to do really unusual stuff.
And
absolutely,
I think Harry Frank was right, where now you have to sort of, there's ways where you have to plan out your simulations a little bit more because of all of the possibilities, and then but be able to create or have that much more power by mixing the different like environment with physical simulations, and playing with the mass of your particles. Like, it's endless.
Yeah, that's exciting stuff. It's been really fun doing this month. Oh, like I don't mean to like sound like I'm wrapping up. If there's more questions too, we could like answer more questions.
That was a good segue into the fact that we do need to wrap up. Quick one from Drake, who's interested about art directing, meandering, or controlling them more specifically. If you got any tips on that?
I don't. I think that like the scale and complexity values of being able to control the fractal field behind the scenes, and also the speed is a big one. Like this, the value of 50, and I'm not sure really what is making that decision to make that default or whatever, or how that influences the particles. But sometimes that feels really fast, and sometimes that doesn't feel very fast at all. So that's a good one. And also, again, remember that particles controlled by particle physics. So you could adjust the mass, and then also have the size affect the mass as well. So you can play with size randomness, essentially, which affects the mass, which affects the meander. So those things can also help you in your art direction of particles as well.
Oh, that's a good tip. I was watching inevitably a Christmas film last night. It was Last Christmas, which came out last year, and at the end credits they have a particle system that looks very familiar to me, raining down little snowflakes over the credits. And one of the techniques they used was to have a series of hero particles that looked to me like they were hand animated, mixed in with the same sprite, mixed in with some of the backgrounds that was more automated. So that could be something to consider as well. If you need a hero particle to do something specific, you can kind of cheat, especially working in After Effects, where you've got the ability to work quickly and so on, then you can kind of use that as a mechanism.
I love that. Oh, hey, really quick, a very quick shout out. In week 1 of this month, if you've been following along, I used some examples from the Geeks and Della holiday special, and it's on Hulu now. So if anybody wanted to watch that, it's
awesome.
it's on Hulu in the
Yes,
US.
I saw that last night. It suggested itself in the list.
Yeah, it's a fun little thing. So, and I use Particular for that all throughout. So
very cool.
Fantastic.
I have to
Cool.
check that
We
out.
are officially up to time now, so I'm going to grab the screen again.
Woo.
Here we go. And just to say, thank you everyone for joining us for these series of webinars over this last 9 months or so. We really appreciate you coming along and spending this time with us. And I have to also say, especially this month, thank you to Chad and Nick for sharing your knowledge so generously again,
Hey,
and frankly, making things look easy.
Thanks for having us, Simon.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. You're most welcome. And one last thing, I know I mentioned it at the beginning, in case you missed it, this whole series has been recorded, and you can see the recordings on the YouTube channel that we talked about earlier. It's the Maxon training team on YouTube. And if you've got any follow-up questions, or if we didn't answer anything quite well enough, please let us know, training@maxon.net. And we'd love to hear ideas for future sessions as well. That's always interesting and useful to know. And next month, we are running more sessions on this demystifying series, and we're looking at volume builder workflows in Cinema 4D. And if you go to the maxon.net site and just click on news and go to events, then you have a whole list of not just our webinars, but other virtual events that are happening throughout the year. But in this particular case, we're the 4 Mondays in January, we're looking at all sorts of ways to use Volume Builder that you wouldn't necessarily have thought. So that's the plan, at least. So, and thank you all for your kind comments as well. And before I forget, Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays back to a bunch of you who have wished us that. That's most
Happy
appreciated.
holidays, everybody.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
thanks everybody. That's really sweet.
And for the kind comments, there's some really nice, genuine comments coming through about how valuable some of these sessions have been. So really appreciate it. The trick is, as I think mentioned before, getting people who are better than you, in my case, actually help out to explain things and delve into them. So for all our guests this year, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yay.
Cool. All right. Well, have a good one. I hope you all get to have a relax and or a play with Particular. No, it can be relaxing too. And have a nice break. And we'll see you at the beginning of January, first day back, 4th of January, for some volume builder fun.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
All right, see you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
All right. Cheers then.